So Highlander started in 1932. It was started by a handful of folks, the most famous of whom is a guy named Miles Horton, who's no longer living, but it was a group of young people, in their 20s and 30s who wanted to establish a new social order. It started out of the Great Depression in response to a lot of economic issues, economic injustices that they were noticing both in their lived experiences, folks who were coming from the South, but also as a part of a desire to be in response to that. And the idea was that education could be a way to do that. There's some things that we're kind of famous for. Those were in our early years. There's some things that we've been doing since then that are along the same educational lines. We've been involved in different things throughout Appalachia around bringing people together to study the land and who owns it in the region. Learning and teaching people through participatory action research, what we call participatory action research, to study their own conditions and study the systems of power and different kinds of things so that folks understand what's going on in the region and what's going on in their home communities. So we've done a lot of different kind of stuff around environmental justice, but at its core, what we've been doing for 85 years since 1932 is helping people learn together to take control over their own destinies and to envision and then live into their own destinies. So been doing the same stuff since the 30s. Words we use these days are what people will call popular education, in which case everyone's a learner, everyone's a teacher. So there's no real emphasis placed on expertise in terms of like one person having all the information about a particular social or economic or cultural issue. Rather, the idea is that everybody has expertise of their own lived experience, and the idea behind the educational process is to bring people together to share those experiences, figure out what the patterns are that are connecting those experiences, adding some information that might be theory driven, or it might just be new information that people didn't have before because someone else has it, and they can introduce it to help explain the situation in a different way, and then coming up with a plan of action for how to address it, and then doing that, and then coming back together and starting the process all over again. And we call that a popular education spiral. There's several other methodologies that we talk about, one of which is cultural organizing, recognizing that folks' cultural practices are sources of strength. So we'll ask people to think through the music that they use, or the songs that they sing, or the art that they make, or the theater that they do, and draw upon those experiences to help affect policy. The faith that people have, the ways of knowing, the range of ways of knowing that people have, are sources of cultural strength. And so as we bring people together from the most marginalized communities, we'll ask them to draw upon their cultural practices as a way of both sharing with each other who they are and building bridges across the difference that they might be representing in the room, and then talking about how they can leverage their cultural practices towards shifting policies. We believe that people don't learn in a vacuum based on their particular age, and that intergenerational organizing is a methodology that we really value here. We're an 85-year-old organization, so the idea, some of that's kind of built into who we are, right? We have elders in movement who have seen the struggles of the past and have a lot to bring to that. And then there are younger people who are going to inherit the world from our current generation, and they have a lot at stake for how things go, right? So, and also a lot of wisdom about current systems, the experiences in public schools, the violence enacted against them by the state, and however you might define that. And so intergenerational methodology of organizing, an intergenerational organizing model, is about bringing people from across generations together to really talk about, what does it mean to learn from each other's experiences based in age and generational stuff, so that you can also pass down like movement lessons. There's a lot of knowledge here that isn't necessarily recognized as valuable knowledge by the dominant culture. And so what we'll do is figure out ways for folks to draw upon the power of where they're from. So that's like place-based knowledge, but also it expands out into the fact of bringing people together into a place, and what does it mean to bring people from all over into one place to really take some time away from the front lines of activism and organizing and direct actions and all the different kinds of campaigns that might be running, or the violence that they might be experiencing in their home communities, and encouraging people to take a step back and just have a little bit of room to breathe and process what they're experiencing. And so that's done really well and valuably and with effect in a space, in one place. And so that place-based or land-based education is a methodology that we consider really valuable and important.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a 21st century context, that deeply listening is the best way to find out the needs of a community, right? And coming in without the expectation that you already know everything that the community needs, especially if it's a community that you haven't deeply been rooted in. And so I think what Highlander gets really right is that we bring people together, or we go into communities and then create a container where people can deeply listen to each other about what is happening in their communities that keeps them up at night, to talk about what solutions look like to solving those problems that are within the state and outside of the necessity of the state, and then create concrete next steps for people to be able to implement those solutions themselves. And I think that that's both good community building because it puts people in deep relationship with each other. They find out they have a lot in common, that some of the people that are harming their communities are some of the same people, that many of the things they're going through are really similar, even if in different contexts. And it creates an opportunity for them to develop a kinship and to actually practice what being in beloved community looks like, not just thinking about it as the great by and by that will come, someday later. It gives people an opportunity to practice liberation right now. And I think that deep listening and that sharing each other's stories and workshopping each other's problems towards community-based solutions, I think is what we get to do really well, and I think it builds an infrastructure that's necessary for the Southern Freedom Movement.
Examples of that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's wild to think about how that's looked over 85 years, right? So the 30s before there was Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, the 50s and 60s when there weren't cell phones, the 80s and 90s, and now the 2000s and the information age where people are so easily able to get information, whether it's true or not. And so I think that even in a 21st century context, how we get people into connection with each other is by literally getting them in spaces together. Definitely using the tools that social media and the internet provide, and taking very seriously what it means to now be able to provide broadband to people in rural community. But I think that the way that it really sticks, the glue that holds those relationships together, is that people actually sit in these rocking chairs in this room and build relationships with each other. And we bring people together, at our annual homecoming, which happens every time we have a birthday in the fall. And then getting just to be in sacred space together, really listening to each other's stories and building together, thinking about strategy and what the world that we always deserved looks like, I think creates a situation where people build relationships past transaction. And I think that those connections last a lifetime. I'm a living example of that. I mean, I think even being in relationship with Alan was influenced by that, and many of the folks in my generational cohort of leadership that came together through being in relationship with Highlander. I think that's critical, that those connections are really critical, because in a political moment where literally the social safety net is being ripped apart, and people's needs are not getting any smaller, that as we think about strategy for the long haul, that we also have to be meeting people's immediate needs. And I think what we've seen in the South for as long as there's been a Southern Freedom Movement, especially one that was so central around the Black Liberation Movement, that it's always been through our relationships that we've been able to take care of each other, despite whether or not the state showed up for us or not, because in fact, most often they don't. And so that's where alternatives to these systems have been created, was through these relationships. And the capacity to do that, to scale, to take care of our people, is also dependent on us being in relationship with each other. The South is the largest geographic region in the United States. And so it really means something that when a hurricane happens in the Gulf South, that folks who have dealt with water crises in Central Appalachia can be like, this is how you get clean water. Or when folks in Puerto Rico need support, folks in the Gulf South are like, yeah, we know what it's like to be impacted by a hurricane. This is how we want to show up for you. And so I think that those relationships literally are building the infrastructure to take care of our people without being dependent on the state. I think that really, really matters. And then within the state, I think that what we've seen is that, Alabama, in no small part, was able to happen last year with the ousting of Roy Moore was in no small part because of the relationships that people across the state of Alabama had with one another. The folks that were leading the formerly incarcerated people's movement and currently incarcerated people's movement were working with people that were thinking about electoral politics in other ways, like through PACs and through other forms of civic engagement. We're working with folks in the movement for Black Lives. We're working with folks that were leading feminist movements. We're working with queer people, right? And all of those, and young people. And I think that all of those relationships led to building people power that will exist regardless of who's in that seat, right? I think that it's literally an example, those relationships, those connections are literally an example of building infrastructure that takes care of our people. I think that's really, really critical in a political crisis like this moment.